From the land of sky blue waters. And if you remember the beer that was associated with that tagline, I pity us both. It's Kurt Berglund with another issue of Pine Tar Great Team Set Briefing. Today, the 1970 Baltimore Orioles. Yes, Earl Weaver's World Series championship team. And one of the teams, and I'm going to talk about this more later in the week, one of the teams that I would have been dead wrong about in terms of the poll. This team, when we did the Great Teams poll about a month ago now, finished a very strong and consistent third place of the 5 teams that we ended up taking from the poll for the Great Team Set. You voted for these teams, and I promised that the top 5 would be in the set, and they are. The 1970 Orioles, pretty much from wire to wire in the poll, were third place behind the 75 Reds and the 68 Tigers. Today we're going to take a look at that team, tell you a little bit more about them in case you don't know a lot about the 1970 Orioles and how you might go about using them when it's time to start playing these teams in a tournament that you'll set up or in a season that you'll set up. Give you some information right off the bat about this team. Might have been Earl Weaver's best one ever, although, again, if you had asked me, and nobody did, before the poll started, before we started doing the poll last month, is there an Oriole team that's going to make the top 5? I would have said yes, definitely. But I would have guessed the 69 team or even the 71 team, I think would have been my first guess because of the 420 game winners. This team did not have 420 game winners. However, let's talk about what they did have. They won the World Series. This was as I said, this was Earl Weaver's team that won the World Series, his only one, although he made 3 other appearances. They went 108-54 in the regular season, 108-54. Then they went on in the National League Championship Series. This was the second season in which there was a championship series. They went on and swept the American League Championship Series against the Twins 3-0 in a very, very non-competitive series. These teams were not evenly matched. And then they went on and played the Reds in the 1970 World Series. And the Reds, to be fair, this was the start of the Big Red Machine. This was Sparky Anderson. It was Johnny Bench. It was Pete Rose. But their pitching staff was pretty beat up by the 1970 World Series. And so the Reds were not at their best. Sparky had blown through the arms of really 3 of his starters, but 2 especially, one of them being Jim Merritt, who did pitch in the series but was not effective. And, so the 70 Orioles won the World Series in 5 games, but I don't think you can say that the Reds were at the top of their form in 1970, even the 1970 version of the Reds. But this Orioles team was pretty incredible. Jim Palmer, and I know 1 lost records. I get that. Don't leave comments telling me about how 1 lost records don't mean anything. I know they don't. Having said that, Jim Palmer was 20-10. Mike Cuellar was 24-8. Dave McNally was 24-9. Not going to have too many losing streaks with that. The bullpen goes 4 deep, and you'll have a blast with these guys in the Pine Tar set. Pete Rickert, a left-hander. Dick Hall, a side-arming right-hander. Marcelino Lopez, another left-hander, and Eddie Watt. Although Eddie Watt didn't have his best season in 1970, these starting pitchers will get you deep into the ball game. And then Earl Weaver had 4 really good, what were called short relievers back then, to close out the game with. It's just going to be tough to beat this team. Team ERA is 3.15. 3.15 is the team ERA for the 1970 Orioles. But don't think that's all, because they scored 792 runs back when scoring 792 runs meant something. That's a lot of runs in 1970, especially coming out of the decade of the 60s. The Orioles could beat your brains in. They could also beat you 2-1, but they could also beat your brains in if you wanted to do a slugfest. They hit 179 homers, which was a lot back then. Not quite in 61 Yankee territory, but they're moving into the neighborhood. This was a big, big power team and a big, big offensive team. Let's look at the lineups you might consider using. I pulled these from Baseball Reference, lineups that Weaver used in the World Series. I want to say something else about Weaver. If you want to read more, he's written 2 things that I've read a lot. One is a book called Weaver on Strategy, which really an amazing book. If you want to pick it up, I'm sure it's cheap on eBay or on a used bookstore. Really worth a good read. He talks about the 79 Orioles, but really he talks about his managing strategy, philosophy. Excuse me, I'm going to start coughing if I don't drink this. Don't worry, I don't start drinking the heavy stuff until at least 9:30 in the morning. And so Weaver on Strategy is really good about how he manages his day-to-day lineup, how he does his bullpen, pinch hitting, the whole thing, personalities. And then there's a book, an older book, called This Great Game, which has a lot of different sections to it, but they asked Earl Weaver to write about managing in a book called This Great Game. It's got a picture of Brooks Robinson on the cover. Weaver writes about the 1970 team in that one, and again, great, amazing to learn about how he saw his job, what he saw his role as. So those 2 things, pick up This Great Game and Weaver on Strategy, and you'll get more about how this team kind of works and fits together, and really good baseball reading. All right, so I pulled these 2 lineups. Now, if you look at Baseball Reference and you look at Weaver's regular season lineups, you'll see Mark Belanger spent a lot of time, about a fourth of the season, a little more than that, I guess, in the top 2 spots of the lineup. Mark Belanger, the 1970s answer to Del Maxville, even though Del Maxville was still around. So Weaver had some funny stuff going on, but he was the first one that I've read to keep batting stats against individual pitchers for all of his players. So he had the front office do it. So he had splits. He had batting averages against individual pitchers. So this stuff wasn't invented by Alex Cora. Anyway, let's look at the lineup. So aside from the Mark Belanger stuff, Weaver's lineups were pretty incomparable. I pulled these 2 from the World Series. Let's look at these. Versus left-handed pitchers, the left-handed pitcher lineup was the one he used in Game 5 to clinch the series against Jim Merritt, who had a very sore arm and probably shouldn't have been pitching. Belanger led off in Game 5. Blair hit second. Frank Robinson was third. Boog Powell was fourth. Merv Rettenmund was fifth in left field. Brooks Robinson was sixth at third base. Dave Johnson batted seventh in that game at second base, and Andy Etchebarren was the catcher. Now, he had a number of different ways to go. Basically, Rettenmund played left field against left-handed pitchers, and then he'd play center field a lot because Blair had been hit in the face by a pitch and really wasn't the same offensive player. He did come back later in the season, but he got beamed with a pitch, and really after that wasn't the same offensive player he had been before. However, Rettenmund was pretty incredible offensively, and he was all right defensively too. He was average. Against right-handed pitchers, this one was more common. Buford in left, Blair in center, Powell at first, Frank Robinson in right, Brooks Robinson at third, Elrod Hendricks the catcher, Dave Johnson at second, and Mark Belanger at short. But there's a lot of right ways to go with the 1970 Orioles batting order, and there probably really isn't a wrong answer, except you probably don't want Belanger up at the top. Having said that, Frank Robinson, do yourself a favor and watch the 1970 World Series highlights, and for that matter, the 71 highlights, and for that matter, the 69 highlights. Frank Robinson, just an amazing ball player. Brooks, of course, everybody knows the 1970 World Series was Brooks's World Series. Made all the defensive plays, but was a little bit of an offensive. I think he's given more points for his defense, maybe, and I think people give him more offensive credit than he's worth, but still a very, very, very good ball player. The one player that I think is not talked about enough with these Orioles teams, who was amazing, and gave them one more chip, one more piece that made them tough, is Dave Johnson. Dave Johnson was an excellent second baseman, picked up a lot of key hits, and made that string of offensive players for the 1970 Orioles just one guy longer. And I think everybody remembers Dave Johnson, 43 bombs for the Atlanta Braves in 1973. And yeah, he tried to power up his game so that he could keep his job when Bobby Grich was clearly on his way. But when Dave Johnson was good, and he was really good, and he was a really important part of the Oriole team. All right. Last part that I want to talk about on this Orioles team that I really was impressed with as I made the cards is the bench. Now, the bench that Weaver put together here is not a bench like you'd have if you looked at a team like the Yankees of the late 70s. Steinbrenner looked for full-time players from other teams, and he'd put those guys on his bench. People like Jay Johnstone, or, he brings in Bucky Dent. He makes Fred Stanley a backup. Fred Stanley had been a full-time player. Jim Spencer, another example. Gary Thomason, he brought in. He had been a full-time player. The guys on the Orioles bench aren't like that, but their bench is amazing. And when you use this team in the Pine Tar Great Team set, you're going to find them to be so, so valuable. First thing was Rettenmund. Now, Rettenmund had a .322 average. He had 18 homers, and he could play all over the outfield. But what a weapon off the bench. If you start Blair and Buford in the outfield, of course, you're going to start Frank Robinson in right. But if Blair and Buford get the time in center and left, Rettenmund is a huge weapon off the bench. Terry Crowley was just getting started as a left-handed hitter, a left-handed pinch hitter. Didn't like his role on the bench, but he was a good hitter. Then there's two right-handed bats. Chico Simone, who could play everywhere and hit, and Kurt Moton, who I call Motten, but that's okay. A couple of right-handed pinch hitters. Bobby Grich didn't hit much in 1970, but he got his game started, and just starting his career. I think Bobby Grich is a Hall of Famer without any question in my mind. He's a Hall of Famer, should be, and he's just getting started. He's one of their backup middle infielders, although Simone is another one. And then a left-handed hitting catcher, Clay Dalrymple, who was mostly with the Phillies, but with some other teams too. And Weaver believed, and he talks about this in both of the writings that I mentioned, in having 3 catchers. Those 7 men make a bench that isn't a bench where you'd say, oh, well, you can plug those guys in and they could play all season. No, but they have specific roles and they beat you. If you pick out what they do well, they beat you. There's no guys sitting there like Angel Mangual on the 1974 A's and you're wondering to yourself, what in the world do I do with him? Or Ted Kubiak, hitting 220 and playing average defense. What in the world is going on there? None of these guys were like that. Each of them had a role. Each of them had strengths, and Weaver knew how to use each and every one of them. This team goes 25 men deep, and Weaver used all of them. So I think that makes them just as dangerous as any of the other teams in this set. If I had to rank the teams that I've carded so far, and I've been through 11 of the 16, this team is definitely in the top 3. This team is going to be a powerhouse for you to play with. You're going to enjoy using this team in your tournaments and your leagues that you set up with this set. I'm very excited to present this team, and I'm hoping that you'll enjoy using them too. That's it for the 1970 Orioles. Thank you for watching the briefing. I'll be back with more briefings as we go, and get the set ready for you to pick up. Thank you again. Check out Pine Tar Baseball at ttlbaseballgame.com. Please click like and subscribe to my channel. Have a great day. So long, everybody.